After nearly 2 years of interest rate hikes, some economists believe reprieve could be on the way this year. But just how much does Canada's housing market need to shift to make life more affordable? Joining us now to discuss is Marc Desormeaux, a principal economist with Desjardins. Thanks for joining us today, Marc.
Happy to be here. Happy New Year.
All right. Happy New Year to you, too. We're putting the focus on housing right now. A recent survey from RBC suggesting just 26% of Canadians can afford to purchase a single-family home. What kind of changes need to happen to make this number grow?
I would really put things in terms of our forecasts, Melissa. We think that affordability will improve in the Canadian economy over the next year. The economy is slowing. That'll put downward pressure on prices. Interest rates are going to come down in the second half of this year. So this will help affordability, especially for first-time home buyers. However, we're not returning to the levels that we saw in the years leading up to the pandemic, for instance, which speaks to how difficult it is out there for so many prospective home buyers.
Now, when it comes to interest rate hikes, you just referenced it there, you're predicting it's going to come down later this year.
That's right. We think that the Canadian economy will enter a mild recession in the beginning of this year, and that will prompt the Bank of Canada to move rates into less restrictive territory. So we think that we'll move from about 5% now down towards 3.5% towards the end of 2024.
And are those numbers enough to, make housing, whether you're buying, whether you're renting, a little more manageable?
Ultimately, the decision to buy or to rent or to even to sell your home is a function of your personal financial situation. So it'll depend on the individual, but we do think it'll have a positive effect on affordability because the cost of servicing mortgage debt over time will be lower than it was in the last year, for instance, when rates were at 5%. But as I said at the outset, we are not returning to a situation where, we're looking at affordability levels like they were before the pandemic across Canada, at least.
I wonder if you're expecting any other big market shifts for 2024.
Well, we're looking at the employment market in particular. That's really the thing that will give you the best sense of whether the economy is in downturn or not. So the few things to focus on, we think employment will slow over the next few months because the Canadian economy has not yet felt the full impacts of the interest rate hikes that were completed last year and the year before. It takes time for those to be felt. So we'll be watching for that. Construction sector, financial services sector are two interest rate sensitive industries that we'll be watching closely. And we'll also be thinking about whether employment is keeping up with population growth. Population growth's been some of the strongest rates in Canada in over 60 years in the past year. So that'll be important to watch as well, not just for housing demand, but for the strength of the labor market.
And I wonder what you think people should keep in mind if they're preparing to renew their mortgage this year.
Well, I think what's clear looking at the numbers is that if you are renewing your mortgage this year, there's a risk of a much higher payment than when you started your term. If you, for instance, bought a home in 2019 with a fixed rate mortgage or 5-year term, you would be looking at, the policy rate now from the Bank of Canada is about 5%. It was below 2% before we got into 2022. So there's a higher debt servicing cost. And so folks should be prepared for that, and they should be thinking about ways that they can mitigate the increase in payments on their mortgages.
And how would you do that?
You could look at making a lump sum payment against the principal, finding other ways to save in your monthly budget. There's a few ways of looking at it. But I should also add, one of the things that we're tracking at Desjardins is sort of the longer term impact. So folks who are renewing in 2025, 2026 could face even more significant payment shocks than those renewing this year. Because if you're renewing in 25 or 26, you likely bought in 2020 or 2021 when rates were at their absolute cycle low. So particularly for variable rate mortgage holders, there could be a significant payment shock coming your way down the road. And so now is the time to plan for how to reduce that over time. So
putting your head in the sand and hearing that news about interest rates over these last couple of years, if you haven't been paying attention to it, you might be in for a bit of a shock at the end.
Certainly there is a risk of that for those who bought at very low rates in 2020, 2021, and to some extent 2019.
That's Marc Desormeaux with Desjardins. Thanks for speaking with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.